There's been a lot made of this term wokeism as of late. It's been used by a lot of mainstream conservatives to denote the cultish tendencies that we're seeing in the American left and I guess the left at large throughout the Western world. And these tendencies developed during the 2010s in a period that, we're retrospectively now calling the Great Wokening. And these terms, wokeism, Great Wokening, they're often very loosely used. And that's because historically what happens is like the online right, something that historically used to be called the alt-right, but alt-right kind of evolved into something else. But still, the online right on websites such as 4chan and on various discords and stuff came up with these things like wokeism, Great Wokening, and then they're filtering down and kind of dribbling into like mainstream conservative circles, and they're losing a lot of their meaning and just becoming really watered down, and then they become quote unquote boomer memes and aren't cool anymore. And that's because you got most of mainstream conservatism, especially in America, is this really like grifting where you have these people saying super boilerplate stuff, right? And they're trying to water everything down to make it palatable to somebody who's generally apolitical, and they're kind of actually making a lot of this stuff softly like centrist or center left oftentimes too. I really feel like grifters kind of like part of their reason for existence is to soften the American right wing base, or I guess the Anglosphere right wing base. But despite this watering down, this original concept that came up on the more avant-garde online right, I feel just there's something that is really important, and it's pointing towards something that definitely exists. That there really is a wokeism, and a Great Wokening. And that real phenomenon I want to talk about here. Wokeism, to me, definitely is a civil religion. To me, there's no doubt that wokeism constitutes a religion. And I want to use this definition I found on Google for religion: the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. I think that's a really good definition, but I'm going to change it up a little bit. The belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a metaphysical, which could be supernatural, even natural governing force. But it's really this metaphysical governing force. And that metaphysical governing force can be a god. It can be kind of like this transcendent force of history. It can be the forces of karma. And the reason I think that we shouldn't think of God or gods to be the definitive thing that outlines a religion is because, some of the most important world religions, especially Buddhism and Taoism, don't necessarily need a god. Right? You can have both Buddhism and Taoism without God or gods. While I do believe most versions of Buddhism and Taoism include gods, there are sects that don't have gods. And so I want to go through some major religions and just kind of explain how they fit this definition. With Christianity, we have a metaphysical governing force. And this metaphysical governing force is the single God who created the universe and who governs it providentially and literally, like, basically, depending on how you see it, program the universe in a mechanical sense and intervenes within it. And he governs it, governs how it functions, decides, like, designed it on the most minute level, and he acts as this governing force for all the effects of both nature in the physical material sense and like a supernatural sense. Right? In Christianity, of course, no one's ever going to argue that that's not a religion. Very slam dunk right here. Let's move into something which is less definitively seen as a religion, right? Let's talk about Scientology. In Scientology, there are clearly metaphysical governing forces which control this universe. The thing with Scientology is not very simple. It's kind of messy, especially to something like Christianity. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Abrahamic faith in general are kind of simple compared to all other religions. They're very simple, easy to understand, and easily transmissible. It's easy to convert somebody to Christianity because it's so easy to say what Christianity is, define it, and that's part of the strength of why Abrahamic religions and monotheistic religions are so strong. But when we return to Scientology, there clearly is this religious aspect to everything that's going on. The universe is governed by immaterial souls called thetans. Everybody has a thetan, and sometimes they have thetans that are trapped in themselves. And the process that was originally underlined by L. Ron Hubbard, known as Dianetics, and which started out as kind of like alternative medicine or alternative psychology, is what evolved into Scientology, but it gives several metaphysical outlines for how the world and the universe at large work. And that human souls or thetans are reincarnated, and that this reincarnation and the general ordering of the universe is clearly transcendent in a way that the Dharmic religions are, although put through L. Ron Hubbard's kind of way of viewing the world, kind of a scientific way or a pseudoscientific way influenced by turn-of-the-century science fiction. Now let's go to a more oblique and very debatable example. And this would be historical and dialectical materialism within Marxist communism. The forces of history and how they are is clearly a metaphysical process. The division between classes in an ongoing battle within humanity, basically leading towards human evolution and higher states of humanity, ultimately advancing towards like this collective utopian fulfillment in communism. Huge overlap with traditional religion, very millenarian, and in the way that I define religion easily fits under religion. And religion has this kind of you know it when you see it aspect of veneration, of cultic practices, of rituals, of sacred spaces. And every single communist regime has had sacred spaces connected to the state that's all civic, a civic religion, right? And it has sacred texts, it has sacred holidays, and it has kind of like this overarching perspective of metaphysical history, which goes back to material and dialectical materialism. And I deliberately went from the most inarguable religion there, Christianity, to the most difficult to argue for, communism. Why? The reason why is because liberalism kind of created and defined the term religion in such a way to be a slur against the things that they detest, as it becomes sort of a linguistic ghetto for things that you disagree with. Yet despite this linguistic ghettoization, Marxism and indeed the Wokism of today clearly have these religious elements, and while you could define these things to be non-religious by only saying classical religions like Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism are only religions, in a sense, that classical religious nature is useless, as everything used to define these classical religions can be found in civil religions or in newly emerging groups. These things are only called religions because they're traditionally defined as such. When we open up the definition to be more coherent, civil religions fall within it, and of course, Wokism. Now, what is a civic religion? According to Encyclopedia Britannica, a civic religion is a public profession of faith that aims to inculcate political values that prescribes dogma, rites, and rituals for the citizens of a particular country. I would argue, to a lesser or greater extent, every state has its own civil religion. The strongest are those seen within totalitarian states. And almost nobody would argue that these ideologies either are explicitly very similar to a religion, or they kind of have a religion as their pet. And I'm going to list kind of like 5 religious totalitarian state ideologies or that have religions as a pet. It's the Stalinist Soviet Union, Juche in North Korea, the cult of reason in the French Republic, state Shintoism in Imperial Japan, and Ariosophie or Nazi racialism in Nazi Germany. Indeed, totalitarian states, there's a tendency for these civic religions to actually strangle out more natural and longer-lasting classical religions and to heavily persecute them. In all those states, to a lesser or greater extent, the traditional religion, whether it be Buddhism in Japan, or Buddhism and Christianity in North Korea, or Christianity and Islam, Judaism in the Soviet Union, Catholicism in the French Republic, or Catholicism and Protestantism in Nazi Germany, these religions were being strangled out in favor of the civic state religion. And when we see in Wokism this new strength and fanaticism of that civic religion, I would say that's clearly indicative of a rising desire of the left in the United States and the left in Canada, United Kingdom, and all throughout the Anglosphere and probably the greater West, of wanting to create a totalitarian society. Traditional American civic religion is very mushy, very sentimental, while Wokism is extremely aggressive and fanatical. And in that, I would say we clearly are seeing the beginnings of a totalitarian society being developed. Now let's talk about the American civic religion, or I would call the traditional American civic religion. America has long had this civic religion. While the United States was founded as a crown colony in Jonestown, Virginia in 1607, the foundation of the New England colonies by the Puritan pilgrims has often been mythologized to a greater extent. I know that when you talk to a lot of Americans, they forget the very existence of Jonestown, and they will say that they don't even realize that it happened, and they'll say that America was founded, in 1620 by the Pilgrims. And from this has arisen the idea of America as a city on the hill, or a nation which has been guided by divine providence. From this idea of divine providence comes American exceptionalism, which argues that America's history is unique from all other nations and is destined to be a natural leader upon the world stage in terms of morality, in terms of freedom, in terms of liberty, and so on. A similar idea is the concept of manifest destiny, in which the American state has a natural right, often defined as a divinely inspired right, to spread and dominate over the North American continent. A civic deist language has developed in the political language used by politicians and other political figures throughout American history. And this language uses a vague monotheistic God, which the major religious traditions in America, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and Mormon, can easily identify with, despite the clear differences within their own religions to each other. The American Revolution has been mythologized. When you go and see all these paintings of Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and all of the American founding fathers, this is where you get this mythologization of the American Revolution and the process of the creation of the Second Constitution. The flag, the Constitution, the Second Constitution I might add, because the Articles of Confederation were the first Constitution. The buildings of the American government, such as the White House or the Capitol building, monuments, and war memorials have become sacredized as places of quasi-worship and objects of reverence. While on the modern left, they see these symbols as kind of these blasé, centrist things and beloved by the right. The left really fails to understand that they're trying to replace these symbols with nothing more than a civic religion, Wokism. Many moderate conservatives and centrists have this inherent repugnance when they see a modern leftist attack these traditional civic religious objects. So when you go to a football game and, all these soldiers, or it's not soldiers, all these players are kneeling and they're refusing to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, they get really upset by this. These, quote-unquote boomer cons and so on get really upset by this, and they define wokeism as this anti-American ideology. But the leftist and these, center and center-right people, they really don't understand that wokeism is actually a revival movement of the American civil religion. And it can kind of be seen as a reformation within the American civil religion. In refusing to respect the flag or the national anthem and destroying these statues and monuments connected to the state is not simply some kind of act of rebellion and open hatred of America, but they're doing this to put something else in its place, something new, and that is the woke civil religion. The traditional American view of history is heavily connected in to the American civil religion. The traditional history of America that you get in 8th grade, you get in high school, that is a very, Whig history, but it's highly, highly interconnected with how Americans see themselves, what's projected in the American civil religion. And, it really begins, like I said, it doesn't begin at Jonestown. It begins when the Puritans left England, and this leaving isn't defined, at least in state schools, as religious. I know that a lot of evangelical Americans try to make the claim that America is like this Christian nation and was founded by Christians, and they kind of take the Puritans there. But when you go to like American state schools, the religion of the Puritans is kind of like whitewashed and forgotten. And it's really this talk of their leaving Britain and England to worship freely, that it's about freedom. And then you move on, the Americans rebelled against the British, and they established the first liberal Enlightenment republic, and then you continue forwards, and the abolitionists fight to end freedom, and this culminates in the American Civil War, and the slaves are released, and black people were made equal. Women then are granted legal equality to men in 1920, but of course, progressivism, so women aren't equal, and there's the, next a new feminist movement later. Likewise, the blacks weren't really made equal at that time. They had to be made equal during the civil rights movement, supposedly in the 1950s and 60s. And people that are still social liberals and classical liberals still believe in this Whig narrative history, and they'll say that it's continuing onward, and now the acceptance of homosexuals and other aberrant sexuals means that we're moving on ever forward in this historiography and this positivist view of history towards ever more prosperity, ever more freedom, ever more equality. And you get like in American history class, you're going to get these hagiographies for national statesmen and for important leaders of industry, and they're made as heroes, like Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and FDR and, ironically, Martin Luther King Jr. These people are made into these heroes. Are given like hagiographies in history, and they're pushing America forward to ever more equality, ever more prosperity, ever more freedom, in this idea that back then in history everything was dark and we're moving forward to a more and more golden age. Now, if that does seem leftist, yes it is, but that is now in retrospect a conservative perspective in the eyes of wokeism. And yes, this is a very millenarian view of history which has been influenced by Christianity, this Whig view of history. And it's millenarian because you're going towards a future golden age. Everything is proving history has a beginning and history has an ending. Now let's go into the theology of the historiography of Wokism and how it views the history of the world. Wokism, in its historical sense, is not Whiggish or millenarian. It's rather something like a pseudo-gnosticism, or the world at large is intrinsically evil and can never be fixed. In traditional Whiggish historiography, the progressive forces of history and society work towards achieving an ever more hospitable society. In Wokism, there actually is no progress, only oppression by an unseen and immeasurable metaphysical hidden force of intersexuality, which acts to prevent any perceived real progress. So, in the eyes of Wokism, a black millionaire is more disadvantaged than a white homeless man. A woman's desire to be a mother reinforces her own impression because, despite her not being patriarchal, that very thought oppresses her, her very own desire to have a child. Indeed, the entire nature of reproduction and differences between the sexes are socially constructed. Members of groups are designated as privileged, and they can never recognize where where the oppression begins and ends. They're incapable of understanding oppression. That's standpoint theory. All of American history is then repurposed into this undying system of universal oppression just for the sake of oppression. For instance, slavery existed not because it was economically viable, but because whites had some kind of inherent drive to oppress blacks. And despite whites releasing slaves and giving blacks numerous advantages economically through welfare, whites somehow instinctually, despite trying not to with the fullest strength of their ability, oppress blacks through some kind of inbuilt thing with their white genetics, basically. Sexism exists not because traditional gender relations push women out of a public space to care for children, but because men have some kind of natural instinct to retard and prevent female advancement. These wounds can actually never be healed, and all that can be done to atone for them is basically giving offerings. And I really hate this because neo-reaction, Moldbug, and all these people, these anti-Christian far-righters, try to make it seem like modern progressivism, or what I'm calling wokeism. I would say modern progressivism, which I'm going to talk about in a later video that I call post-liberalism, and wokeism are two separate things. But like this idea that it really begins, and it's connected to, they're trying to sew in the American identity of pointing out to the Puritans of being kind of like the founders of America. They're not really understanding what's going on, and that's why this happens. But they try to start off by saying that Calvinists are the first leftists, and that every single leftism thereafter is just a more and more extreme version that breaks off of Calvinism to become more and more leftist. Now, obviously, this is not what you see empirically or historically, not at all. But it's really, they don't understand what Christianity is, and they don't understand what wokeism is when they talk about this. And one of the main arguments they get at here is that white guilt, the idea that like whites, if they never did anything to blacks, are still guilty of racism and all the purported supposed sins that white people have ever done. They're inborn with that, right? And that white guilt is somehow similar to original sin, which is mostly Catholic, but this Christian concept in Western Christianity that people are born with the sin of Adam, and the only way to get rid of this sin is to wash it off through baptism or becoming a Christian. But these right-wingers, they're forgetting a very foundational thing about baptism and about original sin. The Christian loses the mark of original sin with baptism. But in white guilt and wokeism, one can never stop becoming a racist, a sexist, or anti-abrosexual. They will always be racist, sexist, or anti-abrosexual. Instead of being baptized, they must medicate their sin through a transactional relationship with the metaphysical forces of oppression. Christians can stop sinning and attain salvation. There is no salvation at all within Wokism. In this sense, Wokeism is far closer to a traditional pagan religion than Christianity, albeit reversed. A pagan fisherman would offer incense to a sea god as a transaction in which he can hope to be protected from the storms while sailing. A Wokist does not have children, on the other hand, of his own, and offers up his fertility to atone for his racism by cuckolding himself and raising an adopted black child. This adopted black child will then be taught Wokism by the parents, and they will likely hate, then as a result of this, they will likely hate their adoptive white parents far more intensely than almost all black children born to black parents. And yet, when he dies, this white will still be called racist. Because despite the self-sacrifice of ending his genetic line and caring for a child who will no doubt hate him and disown him, these negative experiences in the end will ironically only make him perceived as more racist. These actions only were transactions with this metaphysical evil, right? The metaphysical evil of oppression, which cannot be measured and cannot be defined, and which whites really can't even understand. It's just a transaction to lower his value of racism. But he's never saved from his racism. He can only momentarily lower his racism. And in the end, when he dies, as it moves forward, his racism is never removed, and it in fact becomes more intense. He can never escape it, like the Christian can escape sin with salvation. Indeed, morality in Wokism is stripped of ethical do's and don'ts. Adultery or rape is far less immoral than racism or sexism. Indeed, victimhood exists as a super moral justifying condition. A black who commits crimes is more moral than the police officer who is defending his own life when that black who is committing crimes tries to kill that police officer. Thus, the black criminal is heroic and the police officer is evil, despite the black criminal being the aggressor. That is because the crimes are committed because he is a victim. If George Floyd is a burglar, all can be forgiven because he was victimized by the metaphysical system of oppression of unconquerable racism. The various privileges and disprivileges of intersectionality have no doubt then created a verifiable caste system which it seeks to impart upon American society, measuring each individual's moral worth and value in relation to the intensity of their victimhood. And like I said, you can never escape your privilege. You can only do transactional actions, sacrifice aspects of yourself in a masochistic manner. The best way to hurt yourself to try and rid yourself of this privilege is usually to become a homosexual or transsexual. But even then, it can never be removed. You can never fully get on top of this stack of castes. You're born into your stack. You can kind of move up by hurting yourself. But at the end of the day, you're stuck there. There's no salvation. It's a very crushing religion. And one might wonder if the correlation between leftism and anxiety and depression is very clearly connected to this, because their system has no way to save yourself. You're always doomed. You're always dirty. You can never be cleaned. Indeed, Wokism is most defined by them seeing themselves as moral. As such, these moral people must shun their relatives and friends who disagree with their religious views. The traditional American civic religion was a much lesser binding force for society, as it did not have this moral element. Well, wokeism is much more powerful and a much stronger binding element. And that's why it's just consuming all these other secular aspects of American society. You know, conquering video games, conquering comic books, conquering every last aspect of society because it's strongly moralizing. You have to be with it or without it. And because of this polarizing sense, it really strengthens the faith of the wokeism. The wokist, seeing this polarizing tendency that his fanaticism does, only pushes him to become more fanatical. The opposition that he faces gives him strength for his faith. It helps him define himself as a moral crusader. As such, with the Black Lives Matter movement, you will notice that they always pick a very borderline case. While the idea of systematic racism by police departments in America is no doubt an unverifiable conspiracy theory, America is a huge country, and innocent black people are going to get killed by police. Dozens per year. But Black Lives Matter will never pick clearly identifiable innocent people that have been killed by police. Instead, they will always pick very, very borderline, and in fact, sometimes clearly justified killing of black aggressors by civilians or by police in order to deliberately polarize it, and in this opposition make their adherents feel vindicated by this opposition. Wokeism is filled with sacredized objects, rituals, holidays, and cultic figures. There has been a rapid invention of Juneteenth, the omnipresent Gay Pride Month of June, the use of slain black criminals as cultic figures for worship. And, you know, the street where George Floyd died was this host to rituals. It was drive close parallels to American evangelical revivals. The use of the first and now second pride flag really is more prolific a symbol than I've ever seen for the American flag, and arguably a Christian cross within a church. Christians seldom wear a cross hat, a cross around their neck, cross shirts, gym shorts with a cross or something like that. But, you know, wearing a gay flag as a t-shirt, it's so common. And it's the gay flag, the newer, uglier version. It really, like the way that it's decorated around buildings, it looks like the most cartoonish portrayals of Nazi Germany. It should be stated, as most civic religions, wokeism is highly syncretic. Traditional American civic religion is quite vague and allows itself to be synchronized with every other American religion. So when you go to a Catholic church and you go to a Protestant church, in the Catholic church you'll see an American flag side by side with the Vatican's flag. The Vatican flag will have on top the cross, and the American flag will have an eagle on top. When you go into the Protestant church, you'll see the Protestant flag with a cross and the American flag with an eagle on top, right? And then you have this use of the deistic language, which allows these vague allusions to God to be read by a Protestant to be the Protestant God, the Catholic to be the Catholic God, the Jew to be the Jewish God, and the Mormon to be the Mormon God. And these, you know, the American civic religion was always very weakly felt. And the American religion, with your Mormon, Jew, Protestant, Catholic, was much stronger. And that was intentional. And so let's return to another civic religion. Had Germany won the Second World War, there were plans to create a syncretic, positive Christianity. And state-sponsored religious organizations are legal in Communist China as long as they promote the interest of the Communist Party. Imperial Japan transformed Japanese folk beliefs into state Shintoism, With state Shintoism, I would say there's a very clear parallel with mainline Protestant churches and liberal Judaism. And, Aaron McIntyre's saying, progressivism will hollow out your religion and wear its skin like a trophy is very real and very prescient, because mainline Christian churches and liberal Jewish synagogues are really an appendix to the followers of Wokism. Any religion which promotes Wokism and helps it thrive will either be ignored or actively promoted by Wokism, while any religion which stands in the way of Wokism will be derided and probably in the future, when the Wokists have more power, be actively persecuted. In Wokism, there is the infamous courting of Islam. But this is because Wokists, in the wake of Wahhabist terror, have seen that Muslims have begun to be viewed negatively in Western societies. Thus, Muslims have been put, as a result, into a very high caste and powerful caste in the progressive stack. Likewise, the North American traditional Indian religion and reconstructed versions of Indian religions have become almost a state religion in Canada, as Indians lay claim to a powerful moral victimhood. A religion like Catholicism and Mormonism at best can only try to buy off the vindictive hatred of the wokists through doing things like acting as a conduit of their refugee programs. They're really only doing this to try and hope that it washes out their negative perception from their social conservatism and purchases for them some kind of neutrality to protect them. I would not be remiss to address the elephant in the room here with seeing Wokism as a civic religion. Wokism is far more aggressively promoted by large corporations, the media, and academia than it is ever promoted directly by the state. With this, I would say that's absolutely true, but I would also say, in one simple reply, corporations, the media, and academia are organs of the state, and the separation between these entities and the American political life is superficial at best, and power is clearly shared in between the official outlines of the state and these three titans of influencers upon our society. I would also like to point out that the rise of Wokism as a civic religion has only begun, while its roots are decades deep when we see things like Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The Great Wokening is something which only began in haste in Obama's second term, and Wokism is quickly evolving and asking for a greater and greater commitment and fanaticism from its base of followers. Juneteenth was a tradition which began less than 5 years ago, and now it's being incorporated across every corporation and imposed in numerous states, right? Just universally overnight slammed in your face. And every year, Pride Month escapes a little bit more and more out of June, and gay flags are seen in more and more places. They're invading every single aspect of society. And every year, another figure like Ginsburg is being turned into little plushies. I was walking around in this upper class neighborhood the other day, and I saw these flags of Ginsburg flowing, right? She's really being turned into this cult idol. Wokism is really fluid, and it's growing more and more powerful, and I really expect this video to be obsolete in 5 to 10 years, because Wokism will be more poignant and more defined. The Wokism I'm giving here is kind of loose. It's something that you feel. Why I can identify it and say it's real, it's this loose kind of cultic thing. Wokism is becoming ever and ever stronger. And in 5 to 10 years, if America doesn't collapse or there's something like a military dictatorship, we would expect Wokism to be ever more omnipresent in our society, and its end goal is ultimately to become something like Juche in North Korea. But before I end this with the terrible idea that that wokeism is going to be in American society like Juche is for North Korea, I want to leave you with a sense of hope. That's because civic religions have a tendency not to stick. If we go to the Soviet Union, you'll notice that these statues of Lenin were rapidly torn down and were thrown in the dustbin. Ariosophy, the religization, the occultic thing in Nazi Germany, that's a footnote in the history of Western occultism. And the cult of the supreme being in the French Revolution, that was just ended. Just they wrote it off and it ended. No fanfare, it just was over. Nobody said anything about it. Likewise, while wokeism may be this toothy and foreboding enemy in the short term, as soon as state promotion and promotion from the organs of power ends, it'll be like pulling the rug out from underneath it and it will collapse like the statue with the feet made of clay. And ultimately, wokeism will be forgotten like a fart in the wind in the history of the world.